Bonjour, je m'appelle Bekali. Je suis de New York,
Hey, welcome back everyone. Speaking of memes, so it looks like we are getting more rolling in. So again, for the bonus round, you don't have to qualify for the bonus round, but if you want extra points where people vote on the best memes, then they have to submit by the last lecture day, which is May 4th. Okay, and some of you might have, so these slides are full versions, but why, some of you notice that like sometimes I'm only giving partial notes. Am I trying just to throw a curveball? Well, remember that I'm also taking one class on teaching certification class. And one of the things they said is like, if you give, they did a study where they give everyone the full slides and they gave people like a outline. And the students who had the partial notes with just the outline, they perform better. And why is that? Well, it's kind of just like taking notes. Like, have you ever asked someone, oh, I didn't attend class, can I have your notes? Who's actually doing most of the learning? The person who took the initial notes, or you who have the full notes, but you didn't do any of the active listening and note taking? So people who actually so the way I'm like doing that kind of fill in the blank stuff is so that you can kind of play along as you watch the slides, so that you're not just passively watching it with something in the background. Because again, the more you think about something, the more you engage with something, the more a chance that it will stick in your head, that you'll learn it and that you'll be able to apply it and also use it on the exams later on. So yeah, that's why it's like it's not trying to be withhold things, but and all the stuff, like you can just pause if you want to copy down the full notes. But partial notes perform better. If you have an outline and create your own notes, you do better than just having the slides up front and just reading it passively. So by thinking about it and encoding it in your own words, you actually learn more that way. Okay, so we're going to cover the urinary system hopefully, and just like this is going to be a speed run today. Don't worry about booting up any top hat today. So yeah, we're just going to plow through the nephron because the nephron is a very important part. So where is the nephron? Well, this is we're actually like one of the main organs we're talking about with the urinary system, but this is the star of today. So here we have the kidney, and if we zoom in, what do we see with just one lobe of the kidney? Is that we have all of these balls of capillary called glomeruli, and glomeruli, they lead to these tubes called nephrons. Now nephrons, there's not just only two per lobe. It's just showing you, like, if they showed you all the nephrons, it would be crowding up this whole picture right here. So what does a nephron look like, or what are the types of nephrons? Nephrons are generally fall into two different types. So what they are, a little backup with the renal and kidney anatomy. So again, the cortex is the outer layer of an organ, and a medulla is the inner layer. So same with the kidney. So the outer layer is the cortex, the inner is the medulla. So we have cortical nephrons, and cortical, it shares the same root word as cortex. So notice that they are mostly located in the cortex. And the medullary neurons, so they're actually called juxtamedullary, and that juxta prefix actually means next to. So when you juxtapose something, you put something next to something else. So these juxtamedullary nephrons, they have this glomerulus right next to the medulla. And notice that these little loops down here, and we'll get to what they're called. They're actually called the loop of Henle, but we'll get to more specifics later on. So this is the major difference. So the cortical nephrons, they're mostly located in the cortex, and actually the vast majority of the nephrons in your kidney. So again, there are many of these kidneys that like nephrons here. That's why it has that striated that kind of like striped looking appearance, because all these nephrons are all poking their loops and funneling toward collecting ducts that eventually funnel toward the inside of the kidney over here. So back to the cortical nephrons, this is about, well, depending on textbook, they also say like 85 to 90% of your nephrons are cortical nephrons, but you also have juxtamedullary nephrons. So they extend deeper into the medulla, closer and more into the inner parts of the kidney. So these are a little more, like, they're the minority, like depending on the textbook, 10 to 15%. But just know that there are two types, and they differ in terms of like how much they actually enter and penetrate the medulla compared to the cortex. All right, so this is a cartoon of a nephron. So the nephron does not look exactly like this, but showing you it in the kind of like a partially untangled nephron. And you might be like, it looks tangled up to me. Well, it's actually even more complicated than this. So this part right here is the nephron, this kind of pale off yellow colored looking tube right here. So that is one nephron. Now, what we have is like, okay, we have this nephron over here, and they lead to something called collecting ducts that eventually collect into something called papillary ducts. So here's a nephron, and it starts with something called the renal corpuscle, and the renal corpuscle leads to a renal tubule, and the renal tubule. So what's happening is that this fluid, so this is all blood over here, and then it's filtering out some fluid called filtrate, and this filtrate is going to go through this renal tubule, and this filtrate eventually ends up in the collecting duct over here. So this collecting duct, it has many different types of cells, but I think that's more for like advanced A&P. But collecting duct is going to collect, basically in the renal tubule over here, you have exchange of all water, solutes, all these little small molecules. And then once it hits the collecting duct, now it's starting to become urine. So this urine is going to be collected in the collecting duct, but there's also some exchange of water and solutes as well. And eventually these collecting ducts, and there's actually multiple collecting ducts not seen here, but they're collecting in something called papillary duct, and eventually enter the minor calyx of one of the minor calyces of the kidney. So, and if you don't want to know what minor calyx is, go back to the kidney anatomy lecture. Alright, so back to nephron. So the thing about the collecting duct, it's not just one nephron, one collecting duct. You can have many nephrons leading to one collecting duct over here. So this is what I'm getting at, is like, okay, the collecting duct is not just one nephron, one collecting duct. Now proximal and distal, these become very useful in this, because remember that proximal and distal, when you're talking about just gross anatomy, like proximal, or actually this is showing distal. So distal is going away from the central object. So if you're talking about gross anatomy, here's the central trunk and the center of the body. So if you're moving from this way to that way, you're going distal. So you're going away from something. And then proximal, it means you're traveling closer to something. So it's kind of like approximately like near and far. Proximal and distal are proximal is kind of like near, distal is kind of like far into the distance. Okay, so why does that matter? Well, you have these afferent and efferent, or afferent or efferent, but I'm just going to say afferent just to make it more clear. But afferent arterioles are these blood vessels, again, arterioles are carrying blood away from the heart. These are going to carry blood to something called the glomerular capsule, or the Bowman's capsule. That's also a common name. I think you should know Bowman's capsule because it's in a lot of textbooks. Okay, so then you have this special type of capillaries called glomerulus, so I know it's a tough to say word. It's kind of like rural. It's kind of like, I only say it like when I'm teaching about nephrology, and that's like maybe once a year. But yeah, from this glomerulus, it is a capillary, and it carries blood away from it via efferent. So kind of afferent and efferent, they're kind of like to and away. So afferent are carrying blood to the glomerulus, and efferent blood arterioles are carrying blood away from the glomerulus. Now we'll talk more about that later on, but what we have here, when we have a glomerulus and a capsule surrounding it, this is what you call a renal corpuscle. So the renal corpuscle is the glomerulus plus this surrounding capsule. Now what we have leading from the glomerulus, well, you have all this pressure that's going to push liquid. So remember that blood has, like, depending on the sample, well, you have that fluid component called plasma, right? So plasma is going to, so the plasma has a lot of water and a lot of solutes that are dissolved in that water. So that all that liquid that filters through from the glomerulus is called filtrate. So that's going to end up in something called the PCT, or Proximal Convoluted Tubule. And you might be like, oh, what does, okay, tubule sounds like tube. Proximal means closer to a central object. In this case, we're talking about a glomerulus. But what does convoluted mean? So look it up, and it's like convoluted, having convolutions. Really useful, right? Well, what's a convolution? A form or shape that is folded in and curved, or tortuous. Oh yeah, another. So tortuous is not like mean torture. It just means like winding and kind of curving and kind of like kinky, and just able to like, it's just something that's like bending into many curves and turns. That's what tortuous and curved means. So convoluted tubule, this is actually it's kind of like your small intestines. It has many curves and turns to kind of compact this long tube in a very relatively small volume instead of being totally stretched out. Now, then it's going to enter something called the nephron loop. So it actually enters the first part of the nephron loop, or sometimes called the loop of Henle. You should definitely know that because that's a really common name for it. Even though it's named after someone, know that nephron loop is loop of Henle. But what happens from the PCT is that you first descend, and where are you descending? You're actually descending into the medulla. So the medulla is going to, so the descending limb is going to go to the medulla. Then up here we have the ascending limb. So just like descending means going down, ascending means going up. So you're going to do a UE at this nephron loop or loop of Henle, and now ascend. Then you're going to enter the distal convoluted tubule. So distal just means like compared to the flow. So proximal convoluted tubule immediately receives fluid from the glomerulus and the renal corpuscle. But the distal convoluted tubule, this is still convoluted. It's still a tube and it still has like a very windy and tortuous. But compared to the flow of fluid throughout this tubule, it's further in terms of like if you trace like a water molecule from the glomerulus, the distal convoluted tubule is further downstream compared to the proximal convoluted tubule. So this part right here after the renal corpuscle is called the renal tubule. So it includes the PCT, the loop of Henle, and the DCT. And this entire structure, so when you include the renal corpuscle plus the renal tubule, that's when you get the nephron. So the nephron consists of this renal corpuscle and all this tube right here, and then that ends up in a collecting duct and papillary ducts later down the road. So that, and for the collecting and papillary ducts, these are called a collecting system. So again, it's not one-to-one nephron and collecting system. You can have multiple nephrons leading to the same collecting system. Okay, so this picture right here, this is closer to reality. That's why I showed, like, when actually, like, even that in that previous diagram I made, most people when they teach the nephron, they kind of do it like in a linear structure, but actually the nephron folds in on itself. So here we have the renal corpuscle with the glomerulus, and then it ends up at the PCT. But again, this is why it's called convoluted, because it has all these turns. And then it goes to the loop of Henle over here, it goes back up, and then notice that the distal convoluted tubule is right next and actually skirts back next to the glomerulus and renal corpuscle. So even though it's distal, it's actually not far off in the distance. It actually folds back in with the renal corpuscle and the proximal convoluted tubule. So that's why they kind of use proximal and distal. It's not really about the location of the tube itself, but the flow of that fluid. So the distal is going to be further downstream in terms of like fluid that leaves the renal corpuscle. And then you finally have these collecting ducts. But what else do you notice? Well, the renal tubules here are kind of colored in that kind of like, I don't know, bluish, purplish color here. But notice that there's a lot of red blood vessels. So what we have here are these peritubular capillaries. And these are all the capillaries that these blood vessels. So again, once this, so you have blood vessel, or I assume this is the afferent arteriole. But once it leaves the efferent arteriole, it's actually going to enter all these peritubular capillaries. So it doesn't immediately go back to the veins and out to the renal vein. It actually has a lot of exchange with the capillaries over here and the tubule itself. And down here you have a special network of capillaries called the vasa recta. So the vasa recta is surrounding this loop of Henle. So notice that these blood vessels, they kind of wind and weave throughout the proximal convoluted tubule, distal convoluted tubule, and also the loop of Henle, and then it finally ends up in a venule that eventually ends up in the renal vein down the road. Now, so here are the learning goals and key points for here. So basically, what are the basic structure of a nephron? And it gets more complicated than this. But again, like the thing about the nephron is like even for this like regardless of medical school or regardless of, I don't know if they have a unit like that for nursing school, but I mean nephron is like one of the hardest parts in terms of medicine, and this is why I'm just going over the very basics here. Okay, so what's the main function of the nephrons? There are three main functions. First function is filtration, and that's the first step when you're taking the plasma from blood and eventually converting it into urine. So that's the very first step, and this occurs at that very first part of a nephron, the renal corpuscle. Now, small molecules will filter through, but the large molecules are kept in the blood. And why is that? Well, if your cells would filter from your blood into your urine, well, you'd have bloody urine, and you would lose cells, especially like blood cells that you need, like red blood cells, white blood cells. They would filter out if you didn't have something to keep them in. If you had because again, the thing is that this glomerulus is going to be pushing fluid from your cardiovascular system into your nephrons. Now, reabsorption, so absorption is like when something sucks up a liquid, like if you say a paper towel is absorbent, that means it's like it's absorbing and retaining liquid. So reabsorption is when you're pushing in fluid from your blood into the nephron, but reabsorption is going to allow you to reclaim water and also solutes along with it. And secretion. So instead of like reclaiming, this is more like dumping things. So the secretion, what you're going to have is like you're secreting from your nephrons can also take stuff from your blood like solutes or probably not water, but it can take solutes, and it can also dump it into the fluid that will eventually become urine. So filtration is from blood into the nephron, and then reabsorption is when you're reclaiming stuff from the fluid inside those renal tubules and putting it back into blood, whereas secretion is that you're taking it from the blood and dumping it into urine. Now, this is a constant theme throughout the nephron, is that you have exchange between actually it's like a little more complicated, but the overall thing is like you're exchanging the contents within that renal tubule with the blood contents inside your blood. So that's the main part of the nephron. There is the interstitial fluid, but that's more like a middleman with the whole exchange part. Okay, so the renal corpuscle actually looks more like this. And what we have here is the afferent arteriole and the efferent arteriole, and then this glomerulus, and this is actually part of the distal convoluted tubule. Now, to make it more simple, what I'm going to show you is the afferent arteriole is ending up at the glomerulus, and then the efferent arteriole, this is going to lead to peritubular capillaries, and that eventually leads to vasa recta, etc., etc. But you have this capsule that surrounds it. And why do you need a capsule? Well, this capsule kind of forms an enclosed space where you can collect fluid that's being pushed from the inside of this glomerulus. And what we have here, I'm showing in this cartoon, are pedicels, which are parts of these cells called podocytes. So podocytes, the pod part means like podiatry means referring to the foot. So these podocytes, they call it that because it's like they have a bunch of little feet. And it's kind of like having like all these fingers like here. If you have these fingers, but what if you look at your fingers like this way? It looks like little dots, right? So that's what I'm showing with this cross section over here, is that these are parts of podocytes. And what happens is that you're pushing fluid through blood pressure from the inside of the glomerulus and these capillaries towards the space inside this glomerular capsule, or aka Bowman's capsule. Okay, so then what we have here is actually like the lining of the endothelial lining, the cells that line that glomerulus, which is a blood vessel, and then something called the dense layer, and then those parts of those podocytes. Again, it's just by perspective, just by looking at it that way. That's why they look like little dots right here. So what I'm showing you is that the blood is going to be filtered through multiple layers and layers of cells. So this blood, what you have is the blood pressure is going to be pushing fluid, and anything that's dissolved in that fluid, or try to push things that are dissolved in the fluid, past the cells lining the blood vessels, and also through these pedicels. So it's kind of like a filter. And this is why I like to say it's kind of like one of this not product placement, but it's like one of those water filters. If you ever have one of those water filters, what do? You put liquid in one end and it goes through the filter, and then liquid comes out the other end. But what's happening is that there's multiple layers. If you look at like a cross section of one of these filters, they have multiple layers of grit and sand and gravel and all this other stuff to help remove large molecules and impurities. Well, that's what happens with this filtration from the blood through these pedicels. It's kind of like a ultra filtered form of plasma. So not everything is going to get from the plasma past the pedicels and all this dense layer over here. So, but once you have this liquid that has some things dissolved in it, it's called filtrate. So it's no longer blood once it goes past those pedicels. So all the liquid that would be in this space would be called filtrate, because it's gone through the blood vessels and it's also gone through all these podocytes. So they're kind of like, or if you ever tried to like played on the beach and you try to get some like a bunch of sandy water and try to filter it through your fingers and try to filter the sand but let the water go through. That's kind of like what the podocytes, those extensions, are like. So I like to think about, okay, blood, you're going to remove large molecules and keep them in the blood, but you're going to allow liquid through. That is filtrate. All right, so there are multiple things that can affect filtration, and some of these terms might sound vaguely familiar, especially with that whole thing about capillary exchange and the cardiovascular system. Okay, so then let's talk about these pressures. So what filtration sounds like filtration at the capillaries, right? And it involves very similar, like it's a very similar phenomenon, except we're not talking about capillaries all across your body. We're talking about capillaries on the insides of your kidneys. Now, capillary hydrostatic pressure, remember that you have blood pressure due to your heart pumping and beating and and also the pressure of the molecules in the water and the fluid inside the blood vessels itself. So hydrostatic pressure is going to try to push against the walls of these capillaries, and small things like water and like ions like sodium chloride, potassium, and glucose, which isn't ion but is a small solute, can go through these small pores, and something similar happens at the glomerulus. Now, hydrostatic pressure, in general, this is some sort of pressure in an enclosed space. Now, the thing about the glomerulus is that you actually have two types of hydrostatic pressure. The first type is what you call the glomerular hydrostatic pressure. So what we have here is that with this glomerular hydrostatic pressure, is that if this is a cross-section of the capillaries that make up a glomerulus, so this is all blood inside here, when you have that glomerular hydrostatic pressure, it's going to push water from the inside toward the outside. So this is so again, it's going from starting at the glomerulus, but moving it elsewhere. So this glomerular hydrostatic pressure is pushing against the walls of the glomerulus, and this is the pressure inside the capillaries. So again, it's not the pressure pushing on itself, it's due to that blood pressure of the glomerulus. So with overall, this GHP or glomerular hydrostatic pressure is going to move water from inside toward the outside. Now there's another pressure. So that was glomerular hydrostatic pressure. Do I want to memorize this particular value? Again, depends on the textbook, but what I'm showing you is that yes, there is pressure moving water and solutes from the inside of a glomerulus, from the blood into the renal corpuscle and into the filtrate. Now there's also something pushing back, so that's why these arrows matter over here. So we have the filtration, like pushing from glomerulus into the corpuscle. Well, we also have this force pushing back, and this is called capsular hydrostatic pressure. That's the second type of hydrostatic pressure. So again, hydrostatic pressure is some pressure inside an enclosed space. So the thing about this is that here we have a glomerular capillary, but when you have capsular hydrostatic pressure, sometimes abbreviated C lowercase s HP. So here we have our Bowman's capsule, but compared to that previous picture, it's not filled with air, it's not a void. It already has some filtrate, it already has some liquid. So this liquid is actually going to push back to it does have its own water pressure. It does have a little pressure just from having all these water molecules already existing in this space. So the water inside this glomerular capsule is going to push back slightly. So it's kind of like when you're moving from a crowded room into a room that's less crowded. Yeah, there's still some pressure, and there might be somebody inside, like behind the door, that you're trying to push through. So there is some pushback, there is some resistance. So this is what capsular hydrostatic pressure is. It's due to the water molecules that are already in the filtrate inside the Bowman's capsule. And this is going to push water back into the glomerulus. Now, why doesn't this happen? So the overall thing is we're trying to filter blood and make urine, right? So why don't we have the back flushing of filtrate back into the blood? Well, if you compare these forces, glomerular hydrostatic pressure is much greater than, or in a normal functioning kidney, GHP, glomerular hydrostatic pressure, should be greater than capsular hydrostatic pressure. So it's kind of like you have 50 millimeters mercury pushing this way into making filtrate, but you do have a little small amount moving backwards. So this 15 millimeters mercury pushing back. So I like to think of it it's like having tug of war or push of war or something. Like pretend you have 50 people pushing the same object one way and 50 people, so 50 people pushing an object one way and 15 pushing the other way. Which is going to win out? The part with the direction with more force, right? So this is why overall hydrostatic pressures are going to move fluid from the blood into the glomerular capsule and into make filtrate. Now there's another factor in play here. Is it just about pressure? Well, it's also about size, because you have all these cells and tiny openings between the cells, but not everything is going to filter through. So here we have blood, and blood is like, okay, we have all this blood pressure and making filtrate. So water molecules, easy, very small, very tiny. They are easily pushed from the blood into filtrate. No problem there. Now here we have a big old red blood cell, and this red blood cell, well, it can travel through these glomerular capillaries, but they have a hard time filtering through the endothelial cells of your glomerulus and also those podocytes as well. And that's good, because why? Well, if these red blood cells were pushed out, every time you urinate, then you would have red blood cells and you have bloody urine. So it's very atypical. Something is usually wrong if you see the presence of red blood cells in urine. White blood cells, assuming that there's no infection, they're unlikely to move out from the blood vessels and to filtrate. So just by size alone, white blood cells and leukocytes will not travel from blood to filtrate. So if you do find white blood cells in urine, that might indicate that you have some sort of infection. Now here we have platelets, and these platelets, what are they going to do? Well, these platelets are going to not filter out, and the thing is that you don't want clots forming in your renal tubules as well, so that's why it's so important you have that. So that's why you don't have the cells and remember the whole thing like formed elements. So you have red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets. None of them filter through from your filtrate blood into your filtrate. Now, small ions, like things like sodium, chloride, and potassium and calcium, these are very tiny. These are just atoms, right? So these atoms will easily dissolve in water, they dissolve in fluids, including plasma, so they easily get pushed through from blood and into filtrate. Now, what we have with this is that, okay, where I'm showing glucose here. So glucose, even though it's not ions, so small little molecules like glucose and amino acids, they can be pushed from blood through the filtrate just because they're relatively small, way smaller than cells are. So these small solutes like glucose and amino acids can be pushed from the blood into filtrate. Now what we have over here is a huge protein called albumin, and this might sound familiar. So this albumin is not going to be very large molecules. So glucose is a small molecule, amino acids are a small molecule, albumins are huge molecules. And remember that whole thing about oncotic pressure. So albumin should not filter throughout from blood into filtrate. So this is why small peptides, small proteins might be able to filter from blood through filtrate, but in general, proteins do not filter out. So so what filters through from blood into the filtrate? So water, yes. And the formed elements, including red blood cells, white blood cells, platelets, no, because again, you don't want to lose blood cells, because where would you replace them? Your bone marrow would have to generate cells. So this is why it's important not to let cells go every time you urinate. Ions, yes, they end up in filtrate. Glucose and small sugars, yes. Large molecules, no. So again, what do we mean by large? If we're talking about just the pores between the capillaries, I don't expect you to know the size of every molecule, but in general, small glucose and small little sugars, monosaccharides, they're small, same with amino acids and ions. Most proteins do not filter through, small ones can. I don't expect you to know which proteins can filter through. And serum albumin. So again, albumin is not it's a big component of the plasma proteins in your blood plasma, but this does not filter through because it's a huge protein. All right. Are red blood cells and white blood cells in urine usually there from the urinary bladder and urethra? Yeah, so you can also have that too. Like if you have like a bladder infection or urethral infection, you can also have white blood cells. So this is like long after they've been like you already have urine in the bladder and urethra. So yeah, a urinary tract infection can also result in white blood cells appearing there as well. And red blood cells say there is an infection and somehow there's blood vessels that leak or something like yeah, some sort of wound or lesion that kind of allows blood into your urine. That could happen as well. But yeah, so it could be kidney problems, it could be other elsewhere in the urinary system. Okay, so then learning goals and key points. So basically, what is filtration? And filtration, so filtration, associate, when you think filtration, think glomerulus. Again, this is where filtration occurs. It doesn't occur anywhere else. This is just the first step and is a crude filter, but this is the first step of converting blood into urine or filtering blood into urine. Not because you're not going to convert all your blood to urine. Well, eventually down the road, but this is what I'm saying, just saying like, okay, this is the first step in making urine. It's not quite urine yet, but this is the first step. Okay, so we have this glomerular hydrostatic pressure, this capsular hydrostatic pressure. There's another force pushing back here. So this is what you call BCOP. Sound familiar, hopefully. This is blood colloid osmotic pressure, and this is going to move back. And why is that? To refresh you again, so this is why I make a big deal about albumins. These do not filter through. They don't filter through in your regular tissues, and they don't filter through in your glomerulus as well. So these albumins stay in your blood. And again, why are albumins very important? Well, it's all due to that special form of osmosis called oncotic pressure. So here we have the blood. I'm just representing it as two spaces. And remember, the whole thing with osmosis, you have some sort of semi-permeable membrane, and you have the movement of water. So here we have blood, and here we have the capsular fluid. So serum albumins do not filter through. They're too big. And what we have here is like, okay, is this semi-permeable membrane. And what do I mean by semi-permeable? It allows some things through, but not all. So one of the things it allows through is water, but it's not going to allow serum albumin through. So it's already semi-permeable by definition. Now, this water can move freely across between the blood and between the glomerulus and the podocytes, and between the glomerulus and the capsule itself. But with all these proteins here, the proteins themselves also attract water. So this serum albumins, where do we find more albumins? We find more albumins in the blood. So what's going to happen if we're just talking about blood colloid osmotic pressure or oncotic pressure is that by nature, just by having all these proteins that attract water, that this is going to draw more water back if we're just talking about the effects of serum albumin by itself. So again, this is the whole thing as why our blood is able to retain water is largely, and well, not completely due to these proteins, but it plays a significant part in terms of like how our blood is able to maintain water balance. Okay, so again, osmosis. And this is something you gotta know. If you don't understand osmosis, then go back to my lectures about osmosis or go to the textbook, because to understand nephron, you have to understand osmosis. This is one example. So the way I remember is like water will move to the area of higher solute concentration. If one side has more sodium, the other side has less sodium, it's going to move to the side with more sodium. If one side has more glucose, the other side has less glucose, water is going to move toward the side with more glucose. If one side has more albumin, and one side has less albumin, the side with more albumin will draw water toward it. So again, it's always going to go toward the higher solute concentration. So this colloid osmotic pressure is due to these albumins, and these glomerular capillaries, again, these are going to have a lot of these albumins. Because why? Because these albumins do not filter through. So these albumins are going to attract water and allow the movement of water back into the glomerular capillaries. And this is the overall direction if we're just talking about blood colloid osmotic pressure. Now what we have over here is, okay, now I'll put it together. Here's the glomerulus capillary, so a cross-section, and the cross-section of the capsule. So water is glomerular hydrostatic pressure due to our own systemic blood pressure is going to move water from the capillaries into the capsule. But you also have that capsule hydrostatic pressure, which is there due to the water molecules that are already in the capsule, but it's less pressure and less force compared to the glomerular hydrostatic pressure. You also have blood colloid osmotic pressure drawing water back into the glomerular capillaries. Now, is there a capsular colloid osmotic pressure, or a CCOP? So is there blood pressure due to proteins in the capsule? So there is not really. So albumins and just proteins in general, they do not filter through from blood into filtrate. But say you have some sort of toxic drug or metabolite or molecule that's causing damage to the glomerulus or the podocytes or the nephron itself. So if you have like these little chemical toxicants starting to cause these cells to die and prevent, it's kind of like poking little holes in a filter. If you poke holes to a filter, the filter isn't going to filter out big particles anymore. So what's going to happen is that big particles like albumins can filter through. So this is why large amounts of protein in urine, I mean, sometimes people just naturally have protein, what we call proteinuria. Like they have, if you see like foamy urine, that's one, or proteinuria is one potential cause of foamy urine. But then ideally, large protein should not end up in your urine, so because of that small filtration slits. So CCOP is generally almost zero, equal to 0 millimeters mercury. So usually you can ignore CCOP. So what we have here is like, okay, you might be thinking, wait, this is like 2 against 1. We want to filter blood and make urine, but we have 2 forces pushing back. Well, the thing is that these 2 forces are relatively weak compared to the glomerular hydrostatic pressure. So if we put it together, now we have something called net filtration pressure, and it sounds very familiar, hopefully, to you, especially if you really studied the cardiovascular system and capillary exchange. So net filtration pressure is going to involve like basically which way is the filtrate moving and how strong, how much force is there pushing filtrate from one direction to another. So how do you calculate net filtration pressure? Well, what you take is hydrostatic pressure, or actually more specifically, glomerular hydrostatic pressure. So going from the inside of the capillary toward the outside. So it is kind of like that capillary hydrostatic pressure we talked about in systemic capillaries. And then you're going to subtract the capsule hydrostatic pressure. So this, and why don't we have a capsule hydrostatic pressure like for systemic capillaries, is that in interstitial fluid in most of our tissues, it's kind of there, and it actually depends on the organ. It's roughly negligible. It's maybe, if it is, it's maybe on like in the single digits of millimeters mercury. So usually you could ignore it there, but for capsule hydrostatic pressure, you can't ignore it. So usually there's some force pushing back. Now, what you do, and we also have this BCOP, which is pretty much the same because it is the blood, same albumins. It is blood, and you still should have, in a normal kidney, you should have the same concentrations of serum albumin. So this is the same force. You're just adding another factor into there just because there's more hydrostatic pressure pushing back compared to the rest of your tissues. All right. So if you have positive NFP, that means that your filtrate is being moved into capsule. And if you have negative NFP, you have filtrate moving back into the blood. So you're doing the reverse of what you're supposed to do. Now, net filtration pressure, here's an example. So say our glomerular hydrostatic pressure is 60, our capsular hydrostatic pressure is 10, and our BCOP is 30. What is the net filtration pressure? And if you're watching the replay, play at home, pause, and try to solve it on your own. All right, so, and yeah, out of interest of time, I'm going to walk you through this. So again, what we have here is like 60, and you just plug in these numbers, 10 and 30. So these signs are very important because, again, negative means you're doing the opposite direction. Now, what happens is it's 20. So what if you just take this, and what you can do is just take 60 minus 40, and you have 20. So the net filtration pressure will be 20 in this example, and positive 20 because you're actually having filtration in the way it's supposed to happen. You're supposed to be pushing filtrate from your capillaries to the capsule. So that's what we have there. Now, what does this affect? So there's something called glomerular filtration rate, or GFR, and this is very important in the clinic as well. And if you've had like blood work, they might include this in their like estimated glomerular filtration rate. And why does that matter? Well, This is the estimate, or this measures the rate of flow. So how much filtrate are you producing over time? So this is a rate of flow of like how much overall, if you take your kidneys, how much of this filtrate are you pushing from your blood into this capsules and making this, how much of this filtrate are you actually making? So it's usually measured in some sort of volume per unit time. So a common unit is mils per minute. So a normal glomerular filtration rate is like every minute, if you have healthy functioning kidneys, you should be producing more than 90 milliliters of filtrate every minute. So that's the normal one. But if something is happening to your kidneys and you're not producing enough filtrate, this is where you start ending up in having there's actually multiple stages of kidney disease. I don't expect you to know it for this class, but if eventually ends up in this area, what's happening is that now you have a very slow rate of filtration. So everything that's accumulating in your blood can't really be pushed into urine at a fast enough rate. So if you're down here in the red, you have kidney failure and you probably will need dialysis. And you might sound like, oh, I can just use machines. I can use dialysis to balance my blood chemistry. Well, you look up the statistics, and dialysis, maybe on average, that adds 5 years to your life. So it is a terminal thing when you end up in this kidney failure. That's why it's very important if you have a loved one who has kidney disease, you don't want them ending up in the red, because it's pretty much a point of no return with current medical technology. All right, so I know it's very sad, but yeah, this showing that kidneys are, we take them for granted. They're very important. Now the GFR estimates kidney function. So again, GFR 90 or higher, that means you have pretty normal kidney function. But this GFR starts to drop as your kidney function starts. Again, just like how efficient are your kidneys in filtering your blood, making filtrate that eventually becomes urine. So kidney damages, anything that damages your nephrons and disease will reduce your glomerular filtration rate. So what happens is, like, say you're building up things like nitrogen and urea and uric acid and ammonia, like all these metabolic wastes will not be filtered out from your blood and into your urine. So what happens is that these wastes start to accumulate in your body, and this is going to cause more problems besides your kidneys. And also like things like drugs and xenobiotics, like especially in nursing, if you have a patient who has reduced GFR, if you give them a drug that's normally pushed out into urine, if they're not producing that much, if they're producing filtrate at a slow rate with a low GFR, that means whatever drugs they're ingesting and ending up in their blood, it's going to have another round on the merry-go-round. It's not going to filter into the filtrate, and that more of this drug will continue to circulate because you have a low conversion of blood plasma into filtrate. So this is why GFR is important, especially in the clinic. Okay, so then learning goal and key points. So GFR, it actually can get more complex, but I just want you to know that GFR is related to kidney function, and it is a measure of just how, and it also has implications. If you have a low GFR, you're going to be filtering and producing urine at a less efficient rate. Okay, so then nephron, so filtration, and then reabsorption and secretion. So reabsorption and secretion, we're going to talk about the renal tubule. So again, here we have our renal corpuscle over here. And now we're going to move to the proximal convoluted tubule. So with the proximal convoluted tubule, what do we have here? Now, do I want you to memorize this chart? No. Okay, this is more like a reference, and it actually could use some updating as well. But what I want you to show is that here we have the inside of these blood vessels that are surrounding the nephron, and this tubular fluid inside nephrons. So this is the overall goal of the renal tubule. You're exchanging things and water itself between the tubular fluid and your circulatory system. So this will eventually become urine, and this will eventually become blood. So you're doing like a bunch of or it's like back to elementary school days, like you have different lunches and you're saying like, hey, I'll trade you my sandwich for your bag of chips, or I'll trade you my Hawaiian Sun guava juice for your fruit punch, something like that. So that's what's happening, is that you have all this exchange happening between the tubular fluid that eventually becomes urine and the plasma inside your blood. Now, do I want you to know this? No, it's just showing you that there is a lot of things that are potentially exchanged over here. And this part is actually somewhat important, like this interstitial space. This is kind of like the middleman with the whole exchange. Like the main goal of the nephron is to exchange things between your blood and the fluid that eventually becomes urine, but does have to cross this fluid that's found between the blood vessels and the cells that line this tubule over here. All right, so then PCT actually has a lot of these microvilli, and microvilli are again those projections, hairy-like projections from the apical side, or apical is kind of like the top of a cell. So what we have all these like little hairy-like projections projecting in the inside of this tubule. So what do microvilli do? They're there for absorption, and that's a clue to what the proximal convoluted tubule does. It's going to increase surface area because one of the big functions of the proximal convoluted tubule is to reabsorb things. So you're going to reabsorb nutrients like that glucose we've made into our filtrate. Like what if we didn't reabsorb glucose in the proximal convoluted tubule? Every time we urine, we would lose that glucose. And we were like, hey, we ate something, we digested that glucose. We worked hard for that glucose. Let's reclaim it. So the PCT will reabsorb water. It will also resorb ions. So these are things that have been pushed out into filtrate. But the PCT is going to reclaim that stuff because, like, yeah, our body needs water. Yeah, our body needs ions as well. All these ions, nutrients like glucose, amino acids, and vitamins. So the PCT is a major site of reabsorption in your nephron. It's also going to reabsorb bicarbonate. So again, back to the bicarbonate buffer system, bicarbonate is a weak base. So by reabsorbing bicarbonate, you're allowing if you have more reabsorption at the PCT, this makes your blood pH more alkaline and prevents acidification. So yeah, if you want to increase the pH of your blood and make it more alkaline, your PCT is going to reabsorb more bicarbonate. And urea is also reabsorbed there, but it's also secreted later on. It actually depends on the type. So here's a little analogy I like to use for the PCT. So here we have a tubule. So here we have all this fluid. So say you're hiking and this is the flow of the stream, and say you drop your phone. Are you going to wait until the last minute to claim your phone and hope you catch it sometime downstream? Or are you going to get your phone or whatever valuables you dropped as soon as possible? Yeah, you want to reclaim it as soon as possible, right? So the PCT is where your nephron, it wastes no time in reclaiming what's valuable. So it reclaims things like water, solutes, ions, and nutrients, and vitamins. So the PCT is very important in this. This is what we're showing here. Here we have this tubular fluid, and all this stuff here is being reabsorbed. So very important function of the PCT. You do have some secretion as well. So what we have is like you can secrete acid in the form of protons. You can secrete ammonium, and this is where it's kind of interesting. You secrete urea, but you also reabsorb it. So it's kind of complicated with that at the PCT. But the main thing is that you're reclaiming valuable things that are important for your metabolism and maintaining homeostasis in your body, but you're also excreting some waste as well. Now, you also have to talk about something called the transport maximum. So this is measured as basically a rate of how fast you can move a certain amount of something per time. So like it can be in milligrams per unit time, or it can be things like in moles per unit time. Basically, how much stuff are you moving in? It's like, so if you're like talking about people like transporting like water coolers, like are you transporting like 2 water coolers per hour, or are you transporting like 10 water coolers per hour? So it's like some sort of transport maximum is moving something over a unit time. And I like to use this analogy. So back to old school right here, you probably saw like multiple variations, like this is comedy classic, but what's happening is that they're trying to take all these candies, package them up, and take them from the line and put them in little boxes. Now they're happy, they're like, oh, this is easy, this is fun. But what happens if you speed up the process and you have more of these candies coming down the line? Well, now notice that they're having trouble keeping up, and they're ending up like messing up, and some of these candies are eventually going out down the conveyor belt before they even have a chance to catch up. So they've exceeded their transport maximum. And I like to use this analogy because this is like the renal corpuscle. So if we're talking about something like glucose and moving through the proximal convoluted tubule, you have all these glucose transporters that are trying to reclaim glucose because, again, you digested that glucose. You want to keep it in your body. So this glucose, as it comes down the line, if it's a normal amount of glucose, these transporters will be able to take the glucose, reabsorb it, put it back into your body and bloodstream. Now, what happens if you exceed the transport maximum is that if you have a whole bunch of glucose due to a high plasma glucose or blood glucose concentration, these glucose transporters are going to be overwhelmed, and what eventually happens is that glucose ends up in your urine. So this is why we have to talk about the renal glucose transport maximum, is that basically this is the maximum rate at which glucose can be reabsorbed. And what about if you have high blood sugar and hyperglycemia? What's going to happen is that their glucose transporters, you only have so much. If you overwhelm them, like Lucy and Ethel in that classic skit, you're going to have, like, they can't reabsorb glucose fast enough, so then you're going to have glucose in your urine. So this is why for people who have hyperglycemia due to diabetes mellitus, why glycosuria, if they're not treated for their diabetes mellitus, this is why you often see that presence of glucose. It's because these proteins that reabsorb glucose are overwhelmed. And then there's also another type of, like, amino acids should be reabsorbed by your proximal convoluted tubule. So amino aciduria, they got really creative with that one, is when you have abnormally high amino acid concentration in your urine. Because why? You exceed the transport maximum. Okay, so then this one we got almost, we're still okay. I have to cover the rest of the nephron because it's just like, it's one of those things, like once you cover it, you have to finish it. So even though we're supposed to start the reproductive system, so I think I'll post an announcement by Wednesday. This will not be a public stream, so I'll post the unlisted stream because, again, if it's even though we're an educational channel over here, I don't know if we're allowed to live stream nudity or like even drawings of nudity, even if it's like medical education. So I'll post a link on our Laulima site. But yeah, so then this is our learning goals and key points. We'll cover the rest of the nephron very briefly on Wednesday, and then we'll start with the reproductive system. So thank you all for attending, and stay safe, stay healthy, and see you on Wednesday.